Well, here we are, middle of March 2022. 2 years in, or it will be next week, since the first lockdown was put in place in response to the pandemic. So when it first happened, I was as worried as everyone else, and my way of coping was to try and learn as much as I possibly could about its likely impact on me and my family. And because it's been the nature of my business for the best part of 40 years, I began to take a pretty forensic look at the persuasion messages that were being put out by officials. And it wasn't long before the journalist Laura Dodsworth put out her book called The State of Fear, where she documented the use of the nudge unit in messaging, all designed to increase apprehension and fear amongst the population to drive compliance. Now, at the beginning, we needed compliance. We needed people to keep socially distant. We needed people to be aware of others and to look after themselves. But the nudge unit got out of hand, and those fear-inducing messages, propaganda some might call them, continued right the way through the pandemic until, poof, about 3 weeks ago, it all stopped. We're not worried about coronavirus anymore. It's not a priority. It's not an existential threat to the country and its population. The existential threat has now moved on to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And just like that, the media switched off on all things COVID into Ukraine. And now we have wall-to-wall coverage from the broadcast media with its little vignettes, little stories of people who are suffering under the attack from Russia. It's now got to the point where really what wasn't our war until 3 weeks ago, we now have the government encouraging people to take in refugees at £350 a month grant from the government. It doesn't make sense why it's suddenly become the only thing that matters. This is Sutton Park. It's a park north of Birmingham. I think it's officially the largest urban park in Europe, or at least that's what we learned when we first moved to the area 20 odd years ago. But it's a fantastic park. It's kind of wild. It's within 20 minutes of the centre of Birmingham. It's like a large piece of nature. I was going to say a little piece of nature, but it's not little, it's big. Great place to visit, especially on a Tuesday morning when everyone's either going to work or going to school and the place is empty, other than with dog walkers and people carrying GoPros. That's what I do now. So don't get me wrong, I can understand the merits of propaganda. Sometimes governments need to galvanise the population into responding to a national crisis. And the idea at the beginning of the pandemic that we all needed to be careful. As I said, stay isolated, do our best not to burden the NHS with relatively insignificant concerns. So the use of propaganda is legitimate in some circumstances, but once you've seen propaganda and you begin to understand it, you can't unsee it. And I think that's where we are now in the middle of March. So when you read Laura Dodsworth's book, or you read books on persuasion, like those of, say, Robert Cialdini from the USA, and almost any book on negotiation technique, it's kind of becomes easier to kind of decode what messaging is coming your way through official announcements or advertising. And as I say, I spent nearly 40 years being pitched to by salespeople, and then of course being able to train salespeople myself. You do get an idea as to how clever some of these techniques are. Anyway, so here we are. The national crisis, I mean the Ukraine and Russian conflict is now our war. Now the governments are being relatively careful about not poking the bear, to try and, you know, with no-fly zones and such like. But so far, staying on the right side of Armageddon, World War III. How long can it last though? I'm not sure. So you can read loads of books on propaganda too if you wish. It's nothing new. But remarkably, I think many people kind of don't really have a sense of it. Well, I haven't been on Twitter for over 2 years, and Facebook towards the end of last year I came off it. But I'm still on LinkedIn for professional reasons. I'm still on YouTube. And I can just imagine what Facebook is like now, because I log on to LinkedIn once a week, and suddenly the only thing that seems to be concerning people is the war. People can flip so easily, so quickly, from one crisis to another, and then take their opportunity to signal to friends, colleagues, the world, that their concerns are their concerns. I find it remarkable. I suspect many of these people wouldn't even be able to place Ukraine on a map 4 or 5 weeks ago. It's okay, I think. You know, it's okay. I mean, I'm not devoid of compassion, but you know, it's okay to empathize with the tragedy of the war and the difficulty that the general population is facing. It's another thing to wear it as a badge of honor back home here, where up at this point we're not under threat. I just don't know why people do it. I really don't. So these 2 years have taken its toll on many people and I'm amongst them. I think I used to have this view that governments were broadly paternal, is that you worked, you were a good citizen, you followed the rules, and in exchange you pay your taxes. In exchange, the government would distribute those taxes on services for people who needed them, including general stuff like defence for impacting everyone, or NHS, health services, and so on. So you play your part in society. And just like during the pandemic, those of us who were studying it could see that the government didn't behave the way you expected it to behave. So it didn't, apart from building the Nightingale hospitals that were barely used and commissioning private hospitals which were again barely used. We expected the government to be accelerating investment in the NHS to improve capacity. And now we've got, the war is being cited as a reason, but it's not the only reason, because we've had inflation for quite a long time, and we've had failing companies in the energy market for quite some time. But now we've got a situation where we have literally got what's potentially a catastrophic energy crisis in this country that's impacting people's ability to today pay their bills, but tomorrow maybe even heat their homes, or being able to afford food to put on the table. So we've got a genuine crisis, but we're not hearing from the government about now is the time to build, slow down decommissioning of nuclear power, build new nuclear power stations, do fracking. We heard a little bit this morning from Boris Johnson on the Today programme, at least report on the Today programme, that we need to accelerate wind power. Well, that's all very well, and I'm all for that. Wind and solar is great, but it doesn't cover the base load when the conditions aren't right. So the sustainable, self-sufficient energy capacity, it's just not being talked about. And of course, anyone's been watching this for the last 20-30 years knew this day was coming. We knew that. How can you, I got involved in a project in nuclear decommissioning. It was a procurement project, contracting with third parties who were basically breaking these facilities down in a very careful manner, of course. So I got a little bit of experience in the mood in the industry at the time, and you kind of just think, for the last 20-30 years, why aren't these nuclear power stations being replaced by modern versions, safer versions, more cost-effective versions? And despite the fact that you've got companies like Rolls-Royce who've been investing, doing research and investing in producing small-scale nuclear power generation, why the hell is this not the priority? Now, why hasn't it been the priority for years and years and years now? So it's going to impact on every single family and individual in this country, and you've got to fear for where that takes us as a society. The idea that we could come through 2 years of a pandemic out the other side and see economic growth take off and people get a chance to rebuild their lives, that's looking like a fantasy now. Looking like a fantasy. So these are really, really difficult times that are about to get more difficult. You gotta know, you gotta wonder where it's gonna end. So how do you cope? Well, we all have our methods. Mine is to try and understand as much as I can, so now I'm suddenly taking a lot more interest in Ukrainian Russian issues and NATO, who did what and why over the past 20 years or longer. And just like I try to learn as much as I possibly could about the pandemic and the virus. But it's kind of all about trying to understand the right questions to ask. Try and get in a position where at least you're questioning what we're being told. And whether what we're being told is for malign or benign reasons, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that we gen up ourselves and try and understand how best to work out how best we can respond as individuals and as communities to try and protect ourselves and families and friends and those communities as best we can. It feels, prior to the pandemic, as I said, I used to think that the governments were genuinely working on our behalf and that things happened in the world that were beyond their control. Yesterday I was watching a monologue by a data analyst who was describing inflation not as a natural event but as a policy, a deliberate policy that's being deployed or is deployed by governments and central banks. So anyway, the point being is that it's not an accident that this inflation is hitting us now. The question for us, and the question why we should keep asking the question, is are our governments responding, are our representatives and our experts responding in the way that we would respond as individuals and as communities? Are we trying to do the right thing for the short, medium and the long term? So keep asking those questions. I think what I've learned during the pandemic and up until this point is that not enough people are asking those questions, and the answers that we're being presented with don't pass muster. We can all do better. Anyway, that's enough of my ranting this morning. Fantastic, beautiful morning for a walk. Get out there, look after yourselves.